Hello and welcome to Accelerate That App with AWS Amplify Open Source Framework. My name is Nader David. I'm a Senior Developer Advocate on the AWS Web and Mobile team, and I've been with AWS for about 3 years, helping developers and customers get up and running with full-stack cloud apps using the AWS services that we currently support. So this session is broken up into a few parts. We're going to be doing some slides, and we're going to be doing a live coding demo. So we're going to do an introduction to AWS Amplify, talking about the difference between the console service and the open source framework. We're going to walk through the pieces of the open source framework, which are the CLI and the client libraries. And the live coding demo is going to kind of show you how to build a full stack app from scratch and then connecting it to a React front end. So what is AWS Amplify? AWS Amplify is made up of a couple of parts. But what it essentially is a set of tools and services that can be used together or on their own to help web and mobile developers build scalable full-stack apps powered by AWS. So with Amplify, you can configure cloud backends and connect them to your app in just a couple of minutes. You can deploy static apps in also a couple of clicks, and you can easily manage your app content outside of the AWS console for customers and people on your team that don't have an AWS account. Amplify integrates well with frameworks and platforms like React, Angular, and Vue and Next.js, as well as native mobile platforms like native iOS, native Android, Flutter, React Native, and Ionic. You can then use the new Amplify admin UI, which was just released this week for reInvent, and also the CLIs to set up a backend with authentication, storage, data, and other common use cases that you might need. You can connect your app to new or existing cloud resources, so you don't only have to kind of use these CLIs and infrastructure as code tools to create new services. You can actually connect to existing services using whatever front end you're working with. So it could be a web front end or it could be a mobile front end using the libraries. And we have helper components that we're going to look at in just a few minutes that kind of allow you to do this with just a few lines of code. So Amplify is broken up into two main parts. There's the Amplify Framework, which is the open source piece, and that's what we're going to be talking about mainly today. And then there's the Amplify console, which is in itself a service, and we're not going to really be going over that today. So Amplify Framework. Amplify Framework is broken up into two main parts. We have the Amplify CLI, and we have the Amplify client libraries. The Amplify CLI allows you to create new AWS resources or configure existing AWS resources. It's kind of like an infrastructure as code provider, but it's a CLI abstraction on top of that. You can also do code generation. So one of the APIs that we support is GraphQL. So one of the things that the CLI can do is introspect your GraphQL schema and generate all the different GraphQL operations that you would need locally based on your platform. So if you're in a web app or writing JavaScript, if you're writing Dart for Flutter, if you're writing Swift, if you're on an Android app, whatever, it depends whatever platform you're on, we will generate the proper code based on the platform. Therefore, you kind of don't have to write that code yourself, which is pretty nice. It also, like I mentioned earlier, provisions infrastructure as code under the hood. You can do local mocking and testing, so you can basically mock a local environment so you don't have to deploy before you can test it out. You can initialize existing projects. So if you're working on a team and you want to pull down a project someone else has created, you can do that as well. And then you can also create additional environments. So if you would like to deploy an update and you don't want to affect your main deployment, you can create a clone of your local environment, deploying a copy of that infrastructure, make changes, and then only merge over the updates that you would like to have merged into your main environment. The CLI workflow looks something like this. You're working with the Amplify binary, so you would install this globally, locally, using npm. So you would say npm install -g at AWS Amplify /CLI, and then you could start using Amplify. So some of the different services that Amplify supports are listed here. So APIs, authentication services, functions, hosting, storage, a lot of different things. And when you think of these features, we don't really talk about them in the sense of an AWS service. So when we say storage, we're not talking about S3, even though under the hood it might be using S3. The reason is a lot of these different features combine multiple AWS services together. So for instance, if we're working with a REST API, that's going to be a combination of AWS Lambda, API Gateway, and sometimes DynamoDB. If we're working with a GraphQL API, that's going to be a combination of AWS AppSync, whatever data source you're using, so something like serverless Aurora or DynamoDB, along with maybe some authentication all mixed in together. So let's take a look at kind of the infrastructure behind some of these different features. The first one we'll take a look at is the REST category. So using the REST category, you can provision a REST API either using Amazon API Gateway and Lambda, or Amazon API Gateway, Lambda, and DynamoDB if you would like to have some data persistence. The GraphQL feature, which is going to be backed by AWS AppSync, combines a number of services. So in this example, this is one of the basic types of APIs that you might deploy with Amplify, with AppSync. You might see that you need multiple data sources for your API. Maybe you're using GraphQL as an API gateway. You can deploy not only the AppSync service itself, but data sources for DynamoDB, Lambda, Elasticsearch, and serverless Aurora. And then for authentication, the current supported service right now is AWS Amazon Cognito. So the workflow for working with the CLI looks something like this. Once you've installed the binary, you can initialize a new project by running Amplify init. Once your project is initialized, you can begin adding new features. To add a new feature, you run Amplify add and then the name of the feature. So if you want to add storage, you would run Amplify add storage. If you want to add an API, you run Amplify add API. And then once you've made all the updates that you'd like to deploy, you can deploy all of the infrastructure to your account by running Amplify push. From there, if you want to make any updates, you make the updates locally by running Amplify update with the name of the feature. You're ready to deploy the updates, you run Amplify push again. Now, what ends up happening under the hood is Amplify provisions a CloudFormation stack when you initialize a new project. From there, you add AWS services by running the add command or even running the update command to update those services. And you end up with a couple of different resources locally. First of all, you have a local configuration file. Usually, if you're working in a JavaScript project, this is going to be AWS exports. If you're working with a native project, it might have a different name. The local configuration file is going to be basically a combination of key value pairs and region configuration. So for instance, if you've deployed a GraphQL API, you might need the API endpoint to make calls against it. This local configuration file is going to contain that information. It's going to be completely managed for you by the CLI, so you don't really have to update this. But as you add and as you remove services and as you update services, this local configuration file will be updated for you by the CLI. There's also an Amplify folder that holds the back-end code for any services that need any code. So for instance, if you're deploying a Lambda function, the Amplify folder will hold the code for that Lambda function. If you're deploying a GraphQL API with AppSync, this Amplify folder will hold your GraphQL schema and resolvers and stuff like that as well. So you can basically make updates in this Amplify folder, run Amplify push to deploy updates as well, that for code that doesn't really have anything to do with the CLI configuration itself. So once you've deployed and managed your backend using the CLI, you can start connecting with them, the different services. And the way that you would do that is with the Amplify client libraries. The client library support that we currently maintain, we maintain and develop additional features for SDKs and libraries for native iOS, native Android, JavaScript for React Native, and a lot of other frameworks, as well as Flutter. So let's take a look at kind of how you might use this, the Amplify across these different frameworks. So let's take a look, first of all, at JavaScript. You're going to basically be importing these different libraries and SDKs from the main AWS Amplify library. So to install the library, you run npm install. Then you can start importing whatever feature that you'd like to work with. So if you want to work with S3, you might import storage. If you want to work with AppSync, you might import the API category. If you want to work with API Gateway, you would also import the API category. We then have a simplified interface that you can then just make simple API calls. So to pull an image from your storage, which would be an S3 bucket, you can just call storage.get, passing in the key, and that's it. This is going to be an asynchronous call, and then you would have access to whatever was in that bucket and the variable of my image. Very similar configurations are across all the other platforms, but they are, again, platform specific. So if you're working on native iOS, you would use pods. You go ahead and configure and install whatever pods that you would like to work with within the framework. So you would have your main Amplify as well as additional APIs for stuff like API or storage or whatever you are going to be working with in your app. And from there, you can just import Amplify, and you can call different methods on Amplify based on the configurations that you currently have. So if you'd like to work with S3, you might call amplify.storage. If you're working with Amplify APIs, you might call amplify.api. With Android, you would configure your build.gradle both in your main and in your module. Here, you would define wherever the location of your of the plugin that you're working with, and the different plugins that you do want to work with. So you would work with Amplify Core as well as the different APIs. So in this example, we're kind of working with Data Store and the main API category, which would work with both AppSync and API Gateway. Then you would just add the plugins in the configuration that you're currently wanting to work with. So in this example, we're working with storage. We can then call amplify.storage.download file. And we recently added support for Flutter as well. So here you would just define the dependencies that you would like, the Amplify dependency within the dependencies that you would like to work with. So in this example, we're working with Amplify Core as well as Amplify Cognito and Pinpoint. In your Flutter app, you just import the packages that you want to work with, and you can start calling the APIs directly within your app. We also have UI components that basically configure a lot of different functionality with a small amount of code. So for instance, the current framework support that we have right now are React, React Native, Angular, Ionic, and Vue. And using these different UI components, you can do common functionality. So one of the really common use cases and one of the most popular use cases that we see with customers is authentication. So let's say that you have an app and what you want to do is stand up an authentication flow. This is a very common practice for most apps. You need a user to be able to sign in. You need them to be able to sign out. You need them to be able to do things like resetting their password and so on and so forth. So instead of writing all that code from scratch, you can install the Amplify UI components. So in this example for web or for any JavaScript, we might say npm install at aws-amplify/UI React, and we can start importing these components and using them. So here we have an example where we want to put in front of our app an authentication flow. So we've only really added 2 lines of code. We've imported the with authenticator higher order component, and we wrap our main app class with this with authenticator. And now we have an entire authentication flow that we can allow users to kind of sign up, sign in, and we didn't have to write any of that ourselves. You can also configure this. So if you want to update anything around CSS, you might need certain fields to not be there. You might want to add your own fields. You can configure all of that stuff yourself. And then the last piece is kind of the Amplify CLI Toolchain. And the CLI Toolchain is, really part of the CLI, but it does a lot more than just creating and updating services like we mentioned earlier. We mentioned the code generation. There's a couple of other things, though, in addition to the code generation that are extremely powerful. And one of those is the GraphQL transform library. So the GraphQL transform library enables you to add directives to your GraphQL schema to add a lot of really powerful functionality that you might typically be writing yourself from scratch. And you can think of it as kind of like an abstraction on top of infrastructure as code. So some of the GraphQL transform components or the directives that we currently support are right here. The most popular and the ones that we're going to be talking about today are going to be @model and @connection. But these directives do a lot of extra work for you. So for instance, if you want to define relationships between your data, so you might need a one-to-many relationship, a many-to-one relationship, or a many-to-many relationship, you can use the @connection directive between data types. If you want to add authentication and authorization rules around your different operations, you can do that using the @auth directive. You might want to map a GraphQL operation into a Lambda function. You can do that with the @function directive. So let's take a look at the @model directive first. This is one of the most powerful ones, actually. And this is going to be kind of the bread and butter of the GraphQL transform library that can actually be used along with these other directives. The @model directive, when you think of a GraphQL API, you typically think of all the different pieces that you need to actually build a GraphQL API. Not only do you need to have your GraphQL schema, but if you're building it from scratch, you also need to define or you need to write all of your GraphQL resolvers. You need to have your database, and you need to be able to host all this stuff yourself. You also need GraphQL operations that operate against your base type. So for this example, for a to-do type, you might need a way to create updates, delete, make changes to the data that is there. You also might want GraphQL subscriptions. So you can either write all of this from scratch, but if you use the add model directive, it will actually do a lot of this for you. So the add model directive will look at a base type, and it will automatically add all of the CRUD and list schema that you would need. So it will create definitions for create to-do, update to-do, delete to-do, and list to-dos. It will also create the DynamoDB table for this to-do, so you will have a to-do table. And then finally, it will add all of the resolvers that map these operations between the operation definitions in your API to the data source. And it will also even add subscriptions for all of the different mutations. So you can listen to on create, on update, on delete to do. All this code is generated for you, and it's completely configurable. So by default, we're kind of giving you these smart defaults, but if you want to add your own business logic, you can do so as well. The add connection directive, like I mentioned earlier, is a way to add relationships between different types. So in this example, we have a very common scenario where you might have a base type of to-do, or maybe you have like a blog post, and you might want to allow people to make comments. Or an example like Facebook or Twitter, you might have a tweet and you want people to be able to make comments there. So to define that relationship, we just add the add connection directive between the two types that we would like to create that relationship. And now the one-to-many relationship is created. So when a user creates a comment, it will automatically be associated with that to-do. And then we have data access patterns that we can then query. So we can not only pull the list of to-dos or a single to-do, we can also pull the associated comments using the ID of that to-do. So based on everything that I just went over, we're going to basically walk through an entire demo, because I think seeing the code written from scratch and actually doing something also kind of takes this a step further in understanding how all this stuff works. So in this example, we're going to kind of walk through an end-to-end application, starting off from nothing, creating a new React application, initializing a new Amplify project, adding authentication, and adding an API. And we're going to do that all within less than 10 minutes. So let's go ahead and get started. So to start off, what we want to do is create a new React app. So we're in a completely empty directory. We're going to run npx create React app, and this is going to initialize a React app in our project. Once the React app has been initialized, we'll go ahead and change into that directory. Next, we are in our new directory, so we need to install the libraries that we want to work with. So the two that we're working with are AWS Amplify and the AWS Amplify UI React library. Once those are installed, we can now start provisioning some infrastructure as code. So to do that, we're going to initialize a new Amplify project by running Amplify init. The Amplify CLI is going to prompt us for a couple of questions around the name of our project and our environment, but it's going to then automatically detect that we're in a React project and kind of give us the default questions automatically answered for us. So we can kind of just choose all of the defaults past choosing our text editor. Finally, we'll choose our AWS profile. The profile is going to be a locally configured profile, similar to if you had ever used the AWS SDK, the AWS CLI, where you kind of configure a user locally. Once the Amplify project has been initialized, we'll now see that we have our Amplify directory that's been created for us, as well as our AWS exports.js file. We can now start adding new features. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add authentication and we're going to add an API. So we'll first go ahead and add authentication by running amplify add auth. Here we can either choose the default configuration, which is a set of smart defaults, or we can walk through all of this from scratch. In this example, we'll just choose the default configuration. Once this has been done, we'll now have that authentication configured locally, and we can run amplify status to kind of see what's going on in our current project. And we haven't deployed anything, so the operation for the next push would be create. If this was already deployed, it would be something different. But now that we have authentication added, we'll go ahead and add our API by running amplify add API and choosing GraphQL. Here, this will walk us through a few different steps. One of the things that you can do is add multiple authorization types. So if we want to have public and private access, we can do so. But in this example, we're just going to choose public access. If we have an existing GraphQL schema, we can actually choose the location for that schema here. But if we don't, we'll go ahead and start from scratch. And the CLI is going to give us a couple of boilerplates that we can start off with. In this example, we're going to choose the single object with fields, which is a to-do app. And then now we can go ahead and edit the schema, and the CLI will automatically open this up in our text editor. So we're going to kind of remove that to-do type and update this to be a post type. And here we're going to be kind of building a very basic blogging backend. And we want our post to have a title and a content field. The title is required, the content is optional or nullable, so we leave the exclamation point off there. And now we're kind of ready to go. So we can go back to our CLI, and we can deploy our backend by running Amplify push. Because we have a GraphQL API configured, it's going to actually now prompt us for GraphQL code generation. And this is going to basically, again, introspect our GraphQL schema and generate all of the GraphQL code locally that we would need to interact with our API. So all of the different operations for create, read, update, delete, we don't have to write that code from scratch. This is going to walk us through the steps to kind of ask us where we want this code located. It's going to introspect our schema, and it's going to now generate that code and put it in a folder in our local directory. After the API has been deployed, we should see a couple of updates here in our CLI. And now we're ready to start updating our client-side app. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and open our app in our text editor and start writing some code. We can also open the API in the dashboard. So anytime we want to go and see any of the resources that we'd like to work with, we can run Amplify console to see everything, or we can run Amplify console in the name of the service. In this example, we're going to go ahead and go in our API and create some dummy data. So what we want to do is create a couple of posts. That way we can query our posts from our local React app in just a moment. So we'll go ahead and create a post, giving the post a title and a content field, and then we're going to run a query for listing the posts. In both the mutation and the query, we're just going to return the title and the content. Now that we know our API is working, we will go back into our local React project and configure the app to work with Amplify. So we install the Amplify libraries. We have this AWS exports file. We can now configure our app to use that exports file. To do so, we import Amplify from AWS Amplify. We import our configuration from AWS exports, and then we call amplify.configure, passing in the config. And we can now start making API calls to any of the services that have been created within this project. So what we'll do is we'll open app.js and we'll start configuring our app to, first of all, add authentication. And second of all, we want it to be able to call the GraphQL API and pull that data down and render it to our screen. So we'll go ahead and import a couple of components or APIs from React to manage our local state. And then we'll import the with authenticator and Amplify sign out UI components from the Amplify UI React library. We'll also need the API class from AWS Amplify to make API calls against the API. And then we're going to need the query of list post to be able to have our GraphQL operation locally in order to make that API call. And this was automatically generated for us in the GraphQL/queries folder. In our main component, we'll go ahead and create some local state. So we'll set a post array to an empty array, and we'll create a function called setPost that will allow us to update that post array. And we'll then create a function for calling our API. So we'll create a function called fetchPosts. This is going to call api.graphql using the API class to call our GraphQL API. And all we need to pass in here is the query that we're working with, in this example, list posts. Once we have this data, we can call setPosts, passing in the data. In this case, we want to pass in the array of items. So we'll call postdata.data.listPost.items. And this will update our local state with the array that was fetched from our API. Finally, we'll use the useEffect hook to go ahead and call this function when the app loads. In our React app, we're going to go ahead and delete a little bit of this boilerplate code, and we want to go ahead and map over the array of posts. So to do that, we'll call post array, or the post.map actually, and for every post, we'll go ahead and return the post title. We also want to have a sign-in flow, and we also need a sign-out button because once they're signed in, we want to allow them to sign out. So to add the sign-out button, we can just use that Amplify sign-out component that we imported. And then to add the authentication flow, we can add the with authenticator to wrap the main class that we're working with here. In this example, it's going to be the app component. And now we're ready to test everything out. Everything is done. We've built this app in about 30 lines of code. We can run npm start and open up the app in our browser. Here we should see an authentication flow. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create a new account, and then this will automatically sign in once we've confirmed our account. But you'll see that we have a multi-factor authentication flow, so we should get an MFA code in our email. We'll enter that code, and this will automatically, once we've confirmed our account, sign us in. And we should now see the data that is coming back from our API. In this example, it's just post 1. If we want to delete the resources that we just created at any time, we can now run Amplify delete. This is going to delete not only the APIs and the services that we created, but it'll also delete the CloudFormation stack. All right, and that's the end of the demo. So I hope you learned a little bit from that. But as you saw, it's kind of pretty easy to kind of stand up a backend using the Amplify CLI. We use the libraries to interact with the services. We only really worked with authentication and API there, but you might also take a look at storage. You might take a look at some of the machine learning services as well. So if you want to learn more about Amplify, check out some of the resources here. The main Amplify documentation is great. Check out the Amplify community. Check out our Discord server. Check out our GitHub repos. We have a lot of discussions going on there as well. And I hope you enjoyed this session. I hope you learned a little bit from it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of reInvent.